For 60 days, a single narrative dominated the investigation. The figure on the surveillance tape was believed to have approached the residence from the front. The primary focus remained on a street-level entry, while the rear of the estate was largely dismissed. That certainty evaporated this week. A federal forensic analyst informed NewsNation that the front-facing camera never actually recorded the suspect's arrival. The lens captured a departure, not an approach. The rear threshold served as the breach point, suggesting the intruder navigated through the shadows behind Nancy Guthrie's land. He emerged from the property's blind side, a lightless corridor completely devoid of surveillance. There is no digital evidence of his advance, and no record of the exact moment he compromised the house. Before vanishing, investigators claim he repurposed Nancy's own heavy planters to prop open various gates and doors. These were household items, not external tools. No specialized equipment was brought to the scene. He simply manipulated the heavy objects already found on the property. This specific detail surfaced only recently, raising haunting questions that 2 months of detective work have failed to settle. Even with this chilling new evidence, the logic of the crime remains deeply fractured. Once the rear entry is accepted as fact, 3 other elements of the case become increasingly difficult to rationalize: the residence, the planters, and the terrain. A closer examination of these 3 variables causes the investigation to fracture into 2 competing, unsettling explanations. The original footage provided the public with a deceptive sense of clarity regarding the timeline. This updated interpretation suggests a much more calculated and disturbing sequence of events. If those frames show an exit rather than an arrival, then the most critical movements of the night were never caught on film. No lens documented. This is not a minor correction in the timeline. It fundamentally alters the entire profile of the perpetrator. The central mystery has shifted. How did an intruder traverse the rear perimeter, gain entry, and leave so few traces behind? Our team continues to monitor every significant shift in this developing investigation each week. Subscribe to ensure the next update reaches you the moment a new piece of the puzzle changes the narrative. Let us examine the first anomaly. What does the interior of the house actually reveal? This week, an investigative source informed NewsNation that the inside of Nancy Guthrie's home showed no physical evidence of an assault. The source described the scene as immaculate, a word that carries significant weight in a missing persons case. Yet on February 4th, shortly after Nancy vanished, Sheriff Chris Nanos told the press that the interior showed clear signs of a struggle. That initial official statement defined the public's perception and quickly became a foundational fact of the case. Now, we are faced with 2 contradictory descriptions of the same scene pulling in opposite directions. A sheriff claiming violence versus an informant reporting a pristine environment. These 2 accounts cannot easily coexist. Perhaps the early assessment was a preliminary impression, or it only reflected a specific portion of the residence. It is possible that investigative theories have matured since those first few days, yet the discrepancy remains a glaring contradiction. Such inconsistencies are critical, as they reshape our understanding of what truly transpired within those walls. Visible signs of a physical confrontation would suggest a scene of sudden, violent disruption. Conversely, an immaculate home implies something far more controlled, quiet, and perhaps more chilling than first imagined. This conflict does not provide a definitive answer to the mystery. It does, however, suggest that the most basic assumptions of this case are far from settled. This leads to a pivotal question. Given the sheriff's initial report and the source's recent contradiction, which version of the crime scene is accurate? This is no secondary detail. It is a fundamental question that dictates the direction of the entire probe. Next, we consider the flower pots. This detail may be one of the most revealing and yet least analyzed aspects of the crime. Recent reports indicate the suspect utilized Nancy's own heavy planters to keep doors and gates secured in an open position. Consider the psychological weight of that choice. These were not tools brought to the site. They were already part of the environment. They belonged to the estate, and there are 2 ways to interpret their use. The first is a moment of dark improvisation. The intruder arrives in total darkness, identifies the planters, and realizes they can facilitate his movement through the house. That remains a possibility. High-pressure situations often force criminals to adapt and use whatever is at hand. A person acting under extreme adrenaline is capable of making very rapid, tactical decisions. However, a second possibility exists. The suspect already knew those planters were there because he had seen them before. In this scenario, he didn't stumble upon them. He chose them because they were already integrated into his calculated plan. This theory gains traction for one specific reason. Federal agents have reportedly narrowed their focus, interrogating residents about maintenance crews, landscapers, and local contractors active in the sector prior to February 1st. These inquiries are precise. They aren't proof, but they are telling. They suggest the Bureau is weighing whether a suspect had authorized access during the day, using that window to map out the terrain for a midnight strike. This doesn't resolve the mystery. It sharpens it. Was this a crime of opportunity using random objects? Or did the perpetrator rely on known assets they knew would be staged on site? That is the second pivotal inquiry. Then we have the third, the wasteland sprawling behind the residence. Reporter Brian Entin traveled back to Arizona to document the rear perimeter on foot, moving beyond the sterile overhead maps. His findings are chilling. The topography is treacherous and jagged. Once twilight fades, the desert becomes a void of shadows, jagged stones, and thick scrub with zero visual markers. There are no lights illuminating the back of the property, no paved paths, and no logical corridor for someone attempting a silent extraction at 2 in the morning. Yet, the evidence suggests an approach from that exact darkness. This leaves us with 2 chilling scenarios. The first is meticulous reconnaissance, a predator scouting the route until they could navigate the hazards by heart. They would have moved through the blackness with total confidence. It is a haunting possibility. The second is prior familiarity. This individual had been there before, perhaps for a job, perhaps for a legitimate task, and likely more than once. They didn't need to guess where the rocks were because they already knew the ground. The property's layout wasn't a mystery to them in the dark because they had studied it under the sun. 2 different psychological profiles leading to the same conclusion: calculated preparation or intimate familiarity. To an observer, it remains unclear which path was taken. But one thing is certain: that specific entry point isn't the choice of someone stumbling blindly through the desert. We are left with 3 fractures in the official narrative: the conflicting descriptions of the home, the flower pots that hint at insider knowledge, and a desert route that demands either advanced planning or prior experience. 3 anomalies, 3 gaps in the story. Which one feels the most sinister? Share your thoughts below. Each path leads to a different suspect profile. However, a new lead has emerged that shifts our focus forward. Forensic specialists told NewsNation that the investigation must now prioritize the search for a secondary crime scene, a location where Nancy might have been transported after the abduction. A van, a secluded structure, a basement. Why is this critical? Because if the primary scene was tainted, the most damning physical evidence might be miles away from the house. It exists somewhere else, isolated, untouched, and preserved. Finding a second location would be the turning point. Forensic science doesn't care about the news cycle. It moves at its own pace. C. Seymour of Parabon Nanolabs has publicly stated that the killer will be caught. That is a bold claim, but it is rooted in modern biology. Genetic genealogy can bypass a suspect who isn't even in the system. It starts with a cousin, a distant relative, or a forgotten branch of a family tree. Once that hunt begins, time is no longer an ally for the guilty. That is why the secondary scene theory is so vital. It isn't just a theory of what happened, but a map to where the purest evidence remains hidden. Another milestone approaches this week. Nancy Guthrie returns to the Today Show on April 6th. Her initial interview forced new details into the light and redirected the public's attention. This next appearance could be just as impactful. Her words might not close the file, but they could expose a new angle in this cold mystery. We will be monitoring every word. Subscribe to stay informed as this investigation reaches its next breaking point. If you have any information regarding Nancy Guthrie's, a reward of $1,200,000 is on the table. All tips can remain fully anonymous and private. Day 60. 2 months have passed since Nancy Guthrie vanished in the early hours of February 1st. A rear entrance that may hold the truth. A crime scene described one way by the law and another way by those on the inside. Staged flower pots taken from her own yard, and a silent trek through the desert void. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old and requires life-sustaining medication. Her family is still waiting for a phone call, and after 60 days, the most haunting questions remain unanswered. 60 days later, and the shadows in this case are only getting darker. The disappearance of 4-year-old Nancy Guthrie is more than a cold case. It is a haunting reminder of the fragility of safety and the profound responsibility we owe to the most vulnerable among us. When the shadows of a silent desert or a blind side become the staging ground for a crime, we are forced to confront a chilling truth. Our homes are only as secure as the vigilance of our community. This story teaches us that true security is not found in surveillance cameras, but in the strength of our human connections. Nancy, a woman requiring life-sustaining medication, represents our parents, our grandparents, and our future selves. Her absence for 60 days is a collective ache that demands we look closer not just at forensic evidence, but at the neighbors we haven't checked on, and the elderly who live in the quiet blind spots of our busy lives. Let this be a call to action. Protect the light. Be the eyes for those who cannot see the danger approaching from the shadows. In a world of fractured logic and digital echoes, our empathy is the only evidence that never fades. We must ensure that no one, especially those who have spent a lifetime nurturing us, is ever left to vanish into the dark alone.